Hey everybody, hope you can hear me out there. Welcome. I see there's a bunch of people in the live chat over here that say they're waiting. I hope this is coming through all right. Hi, I'm Tony Estrella. I'm the artistic director of the GAN Theater, and this is a little kind of fun thing we're putting together called Brush Up Your Shakespeare Episode 1, which means maybe there'll be an Episode 2. If anybody's still hanging around by the end of this one, we'll see. But we think there will be. Welcome, and happy World Theater Day. I had no idea myself that there was such a thing until I woke up this morning and saw something and some posted somewhere or other, but not a bad thing today. Ironic, of course, to have World Theater Day on a day among many days in which we cannot actually gather to make theater. So, but at least we can do it this way, kind of digitally, and so we're going to talk about Shakespeare today, and a little kind of fun thing we're calling Brush Up Your Shakespeare. So, why do this, I guess? Well, I always get a little frustrated around when, working on Shakespeare with sometimes people, audiences in particular, will come up to you and say, I don't like Shakespeare all that much because I never understand it, or they'll kind of make it about them and say, well, I'm a little, I'm too stupid to get it. I don't get it. I'm an idiot. It's all self-loathing and all the rest of that. And then they kind of shy away from it. I even had a subscriber come up to me this year in the lobby and say, oh, I love your plays so much. We've been coming for so many years. And then she kind of like squinted and whispered a little bit to me. And she said, but when you do Shakespeare, I give my tickets away. And my head dropped and I said, please don't do that. And we're going to be doing it next year. And indeed we are, with our production of Richard II. So I said, please give us a shot. And if you don't understand it, you let me know. So my mission, my primary mission always with Shakespeare, because to me, he's the greatest writer in the English language. And I want to share that infectious, pardon the pun, enthusiasm with as many people as I can. I've been working on it as an actor and a director for many, many years. And I've been teaching it also for almost just as long. And so it's a constant source of inspiration in my life. And I hope it can be in yours. And so I just want to see if we can remove a little bit of the fear, the trepidation. I'm going to take these glasses off because I can see that the computer is being reflected in them. Again, please forgive the DIY kind of Wayne's World cable access-ness of all of this, but we're live, so let's have a little bit of fun. I'm going to watch out for you if you have any questions. I see there's a live chat thing here as we go along. If you want to ask a question and I can get to it and figure it out, forgive me again. I'm kind of getting used to this technology as well. Before we start any of that, I should say I hope that everybody out there who is tuning in right now or who may watch it later on is doing well, and your families are doing well, and you're taking care of yourself and taking care of your neighbors. And by all means, please be out there, follow the public health guidelines, and be good to each other. It's what we need now more than anything. So let's get started. Shakespeare. I promised in this episode, the kind of teaser, that we would focus on one speech, and maybe we'll do that in each episode. Today, we're going to look at, in particular, To Be or Not to Be, possibly the most famous, or certainly one of the most famous, one of the top three anyway, in all of his work, from Hamlet. And we'll look at that. And we'll look at that as an example to see about how his language works, how it breaks down, and why it should be that you should be able to understand it. If you take that fear away, two things have to happen. We have to try to find a way to get rid of anxiety, get rid of fear in the audience. And we, as actors, those people on stage, we need to get better, frankly, at making it clear and inviting the audience to understand. And I think that's sometimes where the communication breaks down. So if we can point out to how we can we can invite you to understand, and then you, in turn, as an audience member, can wake up, can keep your ear alive, your heart and your mind open, then we'll have an incredible communication. Something funny happens with Shakespeare. People leave, and if they really loved it, the first thing they usually say is, I understood it. Like they can't believe it. Like you never say that coming out of another play, coming out of a play by Arthur Miller or Carol Churchill or Lynn Nottage. You never say that. You expect to understand it, but people sometimes go into Shakespeare and they expect not to understand it, and then it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So we want to kind of remove that. So I hope people, I'm looking at some of the comments over here. There's already a question. Maybe I'll take a question first to show that this will be interactive. This is from Michael. He asks, hi, Tony, what are your thoughts on setting Shakespeare in particular time periods or changing setting to improve relevance? Well, I think there's really no set period that Shakespeare should be done in. A lot of people think traditionally that they want to just come to the theater and see people in breeches and pumpkin pants and ruffs and cuffs and fine array and all of that. And that's certainly one way to do it, but that's modern. He was setting them in the modern dress of his day and the cast-offs that he got from the court. And so often today, we do them in the modern dress of our day or in another period. And as long as, I would say, Michael, as long as the conceptualization of the piece enhances the story, brings it closer to the audience, and doesn't matter what you're wearing. It's the language, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Is we're going to concentrate on the language. It really shouldn't matter what you've got on, whether it's a toga, pumpkin pants, or a power suit. This play, I've seen it, and I've been involved in many productions, all of which have employed all of those kinds of costumes, and they've worked regardless. As Peter O'Toole would say, bare boards and a passion, our beginning and our end. That's really all we need, except for we need great stories and we need great language, and Shakespeare has given us better than anybody ever, ever, ever. So I hope that kind of at least begins to answer your question. Why these words now is a kind of question I want to keep in the front of our mind. And one of the reasons that we don't understand oftentimes with Shakespeare is that actors aren't actually saying Shakespeare's words, or at least actually aren't thinking Shakespeare's words, right? What happens all the time is we get a speech by Shakespeare, and then we translate it into what we think is modern English. Now, I want to dispel one thing right off the bat. Shakespeare is writing in modern English. Now, it's early modern English, but it's not Old English. Now, Old English, those of you who can remember back to your high school days, or maybe you're closer than some of us, Old English, you probably read one thing in Old English, and that would have been, of course, Beowulf. But you wouldn't have read it in Old English because unless you're an Old English scholar, you can't read Old English. So there's about 100 people on the planet that can still read Old English. You would have read a modern English translation of Beowulf. Old English is completely incomprehensible to outside of scholarship. It's more, I don't know, it probably would sound more German to an English ear than it would English. So that's Old English. And then you get to Middle English, right? This is just a quick primer. And most of us, if we can remember back to our high school days, would have read one thing in Middle English, and that would have been Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But we would have read that also in a modern translation or a contemporary translation. I'm going to give you a little sample of that because Middle English actually gets a little bit kind of easier to understand. So if you take the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, the famous prologue, in Middle English, and I'm going to get the pronunciations all wrong, but it would sound something like this. One that April, with his showers suite, that draught of March hath pursed to the root. Now, that's Middle English. Now, you start to hear words that sound like modern English. And so the very simple translation of that is, when in April the sweet showers fall, that pierces March's drought to the root and all. All right, we get that, right? It's all words we understand, and it's in modern English. Now, we get to Shakespeare, and by the late 16th century, early 17th century, he's writing in the early modern period, right? And so his language is very, very much ours today. There are some words we don't use, some locutions, and because he's writing in verse and he's writing poetry largely, he's often using syntax sometimes that can be tricky to us. But I want to give you an example. If you take the entire, and we're going to get to this in a minute, To Be or Not to Be speech from Hamlet, which is about 35 verse lines long and about 275 words, I think there are maybe 4 or 5 words in the entire speech, right? I'm going to hold this up to you and you can see them circled in here. See if you can see this in the camera. In all that speech, you see those words? There's contumely, yeah, you see that? There's quietus, bodkin, and fardels. Might be the only words in there that we don't currently use in our modern English. So I want to dispel the notion right off the bat that somehow all the words I don't understand, I don't get it. Again, if the actor is doing his or her job, you're going to get it. And if you're open, you keep your ear open and alive. So let's go back. So look over here at the live chat and see what else we got. See if any questions are coming up. People are sharing links. Someone says, of course, Iron Maiden in the background with an exclamation point, which is referring to the poster there on my right. This is my office here at the GAM. I'm kind of all alone here for now. But you see, there's Shakespeare there up on the bust, and next to him is Iron Maiden. Behind him is As You Like It, and Iron Maiden is thank you for noticing, but they're kind of modern heavy metal Shakespeareans. If you don't know their work, you should engage it. Plenty of recommendations will come out. So let's get back to Be or Not to Be. Yeah. Now, most of you, I assume, will probably know, at least be familiar with the story of Hamlet, or would have kind of kind of taken in this speech by osmosis, even if you've never read the play or never seen it. It's probably, again, one of the most famous. So there's an old joke about Hamlet that it's just a bunch of cliches strung together, because so much of our language, so much of the cliches we use, terms of, figures of speech, etc., come from this play. As we go through this, you'll hear some of them. Right off the bat, the first line, very famous, and I think we all could recite this together. I've been very privileged to play this role twice, actually, and on more than one occasion, I came out to do this speech and said the words "to be or not to be," and then someone finished the line for me from the audience, which is always a dispiriting thing. But it's at least it shows some enthusiasm, and the people are leaning forward and they're like, oh, "Here comes the famous speech. I like this one. I know this one," and that makes them lean forward. And we're going to try to find more ways of making you lean forward, right? So again, to get back to the problem, right? It's not the words. We got the words. We know most of the words, and a good actor is going to make us understand the words that we don't understand. That we might not know the dictionary definition of. But then we come in scared. We still think we're not going to get it. And why is that? Well, one of the things that actors have to do, and one of the things maybe we all did when we were in high school or in college and we were studying these plays, oftentimes we had, let's just face it, crappy teachers. I led a couple of them that I had that first introduced me to Shakespeare, weren't the most inspiring folk and didn't really know how to kind of bring it to us. But then when I got a teacher in college who could, it changed the way I thought of this writer for the rest of my life. It made me want to actually engage in this profession. Quick kind of, biographical thing. The reason why I wanted to become an actor was because of his work. And I didn't come from a background that necessarily would have led me to read him as a kid or be read to him or go to see the plays. It just kind of awed me right from the get-go and caught me somehow, even though I didn't know everything that was happening, but somehow it still thrilled me. Yeah. And I hope that we can do that with an audience. But what happens is, the first thing teachers often do is they sit us down and they say, all right, let's look at this speech, and then let's look at the dreaded Shakespeare Made Easy version, right? Some of you may have these books. There's called No Fear Shakespeare, Shakespeare Made Easy, where on one side of the page you have Shakespeare, and on the other side of the page you have what is a contemporary translation of the content of Shakespeare, right? Which just means, what does it mean? Now, that's not a bad thing. That's really oftentimes a way for younger people and inexperienced people with Shakespeare to get in, to understand, to say, oh, I see what this means, but it only ever gets you to a very, very general way of thinking about it, right? To quote Hilton Als, a great critic for The New Yorker, he was reviewing a production of King Lear that was on Broadway last year. And he said, about that production, it wasn't the greatest review in the world. I don't want to talk about that, but he talked about, why do audiences come to see Shakespeare? And his argument is that they come for Shakespeare's words, not for funky conceptualizations or a kind of look what the director did with that, but for Shakespeare's words, which he defined as this, which I think is beautiful. He says, they are that accumulation of more intelligence and insight about humanity and a unifying and divisive force of politics than it seems possible for one mind to have produced. So ultimately we go back, that's why we're coming. That's why we assume you're in the audience. Even if you're a little trepidatious, you're there to hear something extraordinary, not to hear something banal. And so when we look at To Be or Not to Be on one side of the Shakespeare page, and we look at Shakespeare Made Easy on the other side, and it gives us the general definition or the gist, what happens is we translate it into the gist, and then actors play the gist. They don't go back to Shakespeare's words. They don't put that back into what he's actually saying, which is the equivalent of playing, a Bach fugue on a kazoo. It just is not going to work. It's not going to fly. It's not going to take height. So ultimately, yes, we have to know what we are saying, but then it's the actor's job as the interpreter to make sure that you in the audience know what we're saying. And you have the time and the breath actually to understand it, to take it in, to be awed by it, to be thrilled by it. Yeah. So I'm going to give you an example of, we'll go Shakespeare first, and then we'll kind of go over to the Shakespeare Made Easy version, or what I like to call it, the Shakespeare Made Shruggy version, because it's just anyway. So to start with Shakespeare, now don't expect any great, I'm not going to claim this is any great acting or anything, but I just want you to hear the language alive, especially because here we are stuck. I'm not in a theater and I've got to kind of talk to a inanimate screen, but here we go. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. Right? That's Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare made Shruggy. The question is it better to be alive or dead? Is it nobler to put up with all the nasty things that luck throws your way, or to fight against all those troubles by simply putting an end to them once and for all? Okay, now I don't mean to kind of, put down the Shakespeare Made Easy version. Again, that's there as an educational tool. But if you came to the theater and heard an actor do that, you would immediately ask for your money back. Versus the first version, which you get to hear this extraordinary language, right? And these incredible thoughts wrought in an extraordinary way. Something that lifts you, makes you bigger, better, yeah, versus this, which kind of brings it down. The reason why I say Shakespeare Made Shruggy, because this stuff has to come alive versus it just being kind of like, I don't care, yeah? Here we now are now, entertain us, as Kurt Cobain would say, not for Shakespeare. So let's go and see if anybody got a question out there? What do we got here? People are sharing links. No questions yet. Excellent. Okay, we're going to keep going on. So just in those two sections, you can hear the massive difference. So if I'm having a problem understanding what those first lines mean, right? Then I'm going to go, okay, what does the Shakespeare Made Shruggy version tell me they mean? And I get all this. The question is it better to be alive or dead? Right? That's the translation of to be or not to be. That is the question. The question is it better to be alive or dead? And that's a fair, I suppose, approximation. But what it loses is the poetry, right? What it loses is any sense of the interrogation that Hamlet's going through. This speech is an incredible argument, right, that it gets made. The argument starts with a thesis statement where he discovers something and then tries to interrogate what exactly it means. It goes from generality to specificity all the way through until he's formed some kind of resolution about moving forward. In fact, he uses that word, resolution. So one question I got coming up here is, what is the first piece of advice you give beginning actors tackling this for the first time? That's a great question. The first thing is to actually read it and read it out loud. Yeah, these are called plays, right? We call Shakespeare wrote plays. He also wrote sonnets, of course, but his plays mean they're meant to be played, and they're also meant to reach their power when they come out of a human voice, right? When they're spoken on stage in a room and meant to be communicated. So the first thing I would say is, as you read them, if you want to understand them, you've got to hear them. So much is in the listening. When we just kind of keep it in our own heads and keep to the page, we're not hearing that stuff come alive. So the sound of it. One big thing with Shakespeare, it's very much like telling a story to children. When we sit around a campfire and we say once upon a time, yeah, and we get into a story, and we know we're talking to kids maybe who their vocabulary might not be as advanced as ours, so we're going to be careful of the words we use possibly, but if we use a bigger word, we're going to use sound in order to convey meaning. Shakespeare uses that all the time. We have a word for it. We call it onomatopoeia. Like we would say buzz, right? Sounds like what it is. It's an onomatopoetic word. Shakespeare does that all the time. And for actors, that's a really good way of finding meaning. So I would say it out loud and try to find the meaning in the sound, embrace the size of it. Yeah. So that would be the first piece of advice. There's going to be many that come over that. A couple more questions coming in. To help me follow along, which text are you using? The Arden. That's a good, if you want to have this. No, it's not the Arden. It is just, I just kind of printed it out off the thing, and the text is in actually my head. So, so any text you follow along, you should be okay with, I think. But the Arden is the best. If you can get the Arden, get the Arden. And then Michael asks again, how much does the meter influence the reading acting? Ooh, we're getting advanced questions now about meter. We haven't even gotten to that. I should define my terms a little bit, right? So the first thing is we talk about this being in verse, the Shakespeare, and then this Shakespeare Made Shruggy is in prose. And there's a big difference between verse and prose. There are essentially three kinds of communication or so on stage, where we have prose, we have verse, and then we have singing, which is verse connected to pitches, right, where there's an actual score written into it. Prose is how we're communicating now, right? Is the everyday, is the sentence structure every day. Verse is put into poetic form, meaning it has a deliberate rhythm, right? Shakespeare uses a verse form. We call it blank verse, is a very easy way to put it. The technical term for it is, and this is getting a little insider baseball, the audience doesn't really need to know this, but the technical term for it is called iambic pentameter, which means it describes the way the rhythm works. And it's Greek words, etc. Penta, meaning five, 5 feet in the meter. The iambic as an adjective is used to describe what each of those feet look like. So to give you an example, a very famous line from Romeo and Juliet, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks, right? If we just take that, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks. That's one verse line. That's 10 syllables, 5 feet. Each syllable is an iamb. Each foot is an iamb, meaning it has 2 syllables. And the iamb is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, right? So, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks. It mimics the heartbeat, bum, 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 right? It's a very natural way of speaking. Why did Shakespeare choose to use the iambic pentameter line to express himself as a poet? Other playwrights use different kinds of lines. None were quite as successful. Iambic pentameter works really well because it tends to be the way we speak in life. Just like that line I just said, it tends to be the way we speak in life, right? In English language, we use the language like that. And that 5 or 10 syllable verse line is also where our breath tends to regenerate itself as we kind of go thought by thought through Shakespeare. So he's not trying to do something really, really fancy. He's just lifting the language and giving it rhythm. And what he's doing wonderfully, better than any playwright, any writer who ever lived, is because he's using rhythm. And then when he breaks rhythm and when he does different things with it, he's actually telling the actor how to act the line, which is brilliant, right? It makes it actually easier. People ask often to me, is Shakespeare harder than any other play? And I don't actually think it is. It's certainly easier to remember. I will give you that, because the rhythm, it's like memorizing a song often. But it's also, he gives you so much that he actually makes your job easier. And over the course of this episode, if we do another one, we'll talk more and more about what those things are. What else do we got here? Some say Shakespeare's work is elitist and irrelevant. How do you respond? Oh, my goodness gracious. That's because we have inculcated a kind of idea that it's only for smart people. Somehow you go to college and you get an education. I'll give an example of why this is not true, because I came to it before I had any kind of formal education that trained me in it, other than kind of a high school class, which everybody had. My dad, who saw a lot of Shakespeare when he was alive in his life, because I did a lot of it. And my dad didn't have a college education. He was a smart guy, but he didn't have a college education. Wasn't particularly a reader, but he would come dutifully in the beginning to see his son's weird theatrical productions. And the very first play I was ever in was a college production of Comedy of Errors, which he enjoyed because some of it was funny, and I had a weird costume and etc. And I kind of did stupid things. And so he got a kick out of it, but he didn't understand it, and I could tell. And then, about 30 Shakespearean productions later, he would often look forward to them. He would come out and we would talk about it and have a much more in-depth discussion about it. And it was a couple of things happened. He lost his fear of, this isn't for me. I'm a truck driver. I'm not supposed to know what this means. He realized it was for him. And his son got a little bit better over the years at acting, so was able to be clearer, and he was able to understand it because the actors were getting better. So when those two things come together, it takes it away from being elitist. Remember, in Shakespeare's time, this was for everybody, right? The theater is often looked at as an elitist form since the arrival or rise of television in the mid 20th century, right? Took over as the most populous form. But everybody used to go to the theater, and hopefully, maybe on the other side of all of this we're going through now, will sharpen the appetite to get everybody to go back and feel like it is truly the democratic form that it has always been since it arose with the rise of democracy in ancient Greece. That's a high hope, but we'll see. But it's definitely not just for people with educations or anything else. Matter of fact, in Shakespeare's day, you'd have the way the Globe is set up, if you've ever seen it, the people who could afford more and put a cushion on their seat would sit up higher, and they wanted to be seen. But in the vast middle of that space, there's about 1,000 people would stand and pay a penny a piece to come in. And this was written in their language. This was not written in a language they couldn't understand. They were also much better at listening. It was much more of an oral, AURAL society versus a visual one. So they were attuned to listening more. And that's something that we all could get better at as well. So thank you for that question. Great question. what is this? Bob asks, compare some of Shakespeare's topics and their relevance to our world today. Well, it's all over the place. The only reason we do these plays now, here 400 years on, is because they still mean something to us. Yes, they're brilliantly written. They're filled with all sorts of kind of wonderful poetry, but they have to actually mean something to the here and now. I'll give you a great example of this. I didn't get to see the production myself, but I recommended this on one of our social media accounts. It's a great new book out by James Shapiro, who's a wonderful writer about Shakespeare, called Shakespeare in a Divided America. And he charts the course of the history of Shakespeare productions in our country and how what they meant to Americans at that time, and looks at very specific political and social things that were going on that were mirrored in the plays. And he begins it with a very detailed account, because he worked on it, of the recent public theater production directed by Oscar Eustis, who many of us know, who was a longtime artistic director of Trinity Rep, and now runs the public. And he directed a production 2 summers ago, or 3 summers ago, in the park of Julius Caesar, in which was very, very, to go back to Michael's question that began all this, was a very, very contemporary dressed production meant to evoke the here and now. Julius Caesar was made to look very much like Donald Trump. Calpurnia, his wife, made to very much look like Melania Trump. And of course, there's an assassination of Julius Caesar in that play, and you've probably heard about the brouhaha that surrounded that. And it gives a blow-by-blow account of that, and of looking at a play that asks a very, very specific question about how do we change our leadership when we think that, how do we overcome a tyranny? And certainly when I was not advocating for political assassination in any way, shape, or form, but took on that question very seriously at a time when that's been in a lot of people's minds. And made for what I only know by anecdote sounded like an incredibly powerful production. So these plays are constantly springing up and being, very, very relevant to what we are today. In fact, Richard II we picked for next season because that's maybe his most, after Hamlet, his most beautifully poetic play. It's 100% in verse, but more to the point of its content, it's about a society coming to terms with its leadership and trying to decide on how it moves on past its current leadership and what are the consequences of regime change, to put it mildly. So these plays are always kind of hitting us right where we live today. And if not, I think we would stop doing them. But somehow he managed to catch so much of how we live, not only in his time, but for all time. Someone was talking, I was a groundling once, says John. My best friend slept on the ground between acts, which is a good way to do it. If you have to stand up for 4 hours, if you're watching a long play, then, you're probably going to need a nap. Anyway, let's get back to Hamlet here. Yeah. So where were we? I keep digressing, which is my want, right? So back to this version, the verse. We were talking about verse, and we were talking about how it works. Iambic pentameter, you don't need to know that much about it to enjoy it. As Ian McKellen once brilliantly said, and I'll put a little thing, if you want to know more about how Shakespeare works, especially if you're an actor, I would highly recommend this set of DVDs. It's called Playing Shakespeare. You can see the genius Judi Dench here on the front, and it was something the RSC made about, almost 40 years ago now, with all these brilliant actors who come in and kind of rehearse and talk about how to actually work Shakespeare and act Shakespeare. And they go through all of this kind of stuff in there. But in this, Ian McKellen participates, a very young Ian McKellen participates. And at one point he says, no one comes to the theater, no audience comes to the theater to hear verse. They don't want, Romeo to come out and say, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. No one. They want to see someone live in front of them. Yeah, again, the verse is a tool to make this language come alive and to fill us. Good. And someone just points out all that stuff is on YouTube, right? So you don't have to go out and buy DVDs anymore. You can tell my age by all of this. So get on YouTube and check that stuff out. It's great. I also have another recommendation for anybody who's a more American version of a lot of the same stuff. This is by Barry Edelstein. It's called Thinking Shakespeare. It's a great primer and a how-to on how Shakespeare's language works for the actor. And again, it's really important that actors know this. Sometimes we're not trained, unfortunately, that way. We just get up there and we kind of feel or improvise our way through it, versus understanding some of the techniques that allow Shakespeare to really come alive. Again, our principle, the thing we should all just we should put our hands on the complete works of Shakespeare and take a vow that the first principle should be clarity, right? You make it clear. Sometimes I think the best compliment for lack of a better term, that I've ever gotten after a Shakespeare performance as an audience member, and it's happened a bunch, comes up and says, um, "How come you weren't doing Shakespeare?" And you go, what? Oh, it's a great. They're actually, they're not being, giving you a backhanded compliment. What they're saying is, thank you for letting me understand. It sounded to me like you were speaking in your own language. That's the best compliment an actor can get doing this. That it should sound like it's yours, that it's coming from you all the time. Again, to go back to, and that's Barry Edelstein says in this book, this wonderful book, why these words now? And if an actor can answer that question each time, and really specifically use those words Shakespeare gives you, again, to actually say to be or not to be, that is the question. And act that versus the question is it better to be alive or dead, right? Actually act what Shakespeare wrote, and the audience will come alive to it. So again, back to this verse, iambic pentameter, blank verse, da 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 da. That just helps us. That just helps us kind of understand the rhythm. Who's the author for Thinking Shakespeare again? Barry Edelstein. He runs the Old Globe Theater in San Diego. Wonderful, wonderful director. He's directed at Trinity Rep years ago. Used to run Classic Stage Company, and now he's running the Old Globe, and is a great, great American Shakespearean. Here's a question: what is your favorite Shakespearean role to perform, and what is your favorite role to see performed? Hamlet, Hamlet, and Hamlet, and Hamlet, and Hamlet is the greatest, and a privilege that anybody that gets to take it on. And anytime you get to see it, it's wonderful to see, because there's as many Hamlets as many people there are to play them, and there always will be. There's no definitive anything about it. It's such a kind of complete and complex part that to watch anybody kind of take it on and put one foot in front of the other and think their way through that is the kind of greatest privilege that I ever have have had as an audience member, having seen people, actors like me who nobody knows or cares about, and be brilliant in it, and then big superstars like Ray Fiennes, and the greatest performance of it I've ever seen, which is Simon Russell Beale, kind of make their way through that is the greatest privilege. So back to the speech itself. So how do actors do that? How do actors make it clear, right? That really is what we should be kind of focusing on. And there's a lot of ways and techniques that we do it. And this isn't just for actors. This is for the audience, so that you can actually hold us to account. I think that somehow when we go to see Shakespeare that is monotone, that is not carved, and that just seems like that people are saying somebody else's words, we go, that's not so good. Shakespeare, I don't like him. And it's not Shakespeare's fault. He's got so much to offer, right? This writing has so much. Who cares about Shakespeare? We don't know who he was. But the writing, the plays live on, right? And have so much to offer. So it really is up to us. And we need audiences to hold us to account as technicians, as craftspeople, as artists, that we make this better, that we get better at it. So how do actors do it? What should we be listening for? Now, if I go through the speech and I say, to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to, 'tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die. Now, I know what I'm saying. Yeah, I understand all of that, what I just said, but you didn't, because I wasn't helping, I wasn't inviting you, I wasn't inflecting, is a great word, but it really just means to invite the audience to understand and to think with me. If I take you through that and say, I'm discovering this in the moment, I want you to discover it with me. I give you time to digest it and to hear what's important. I begin to do something that as actors we often call carving. What I just did was kind of monotone and there, and kind of again, Shakespeare made shruggy, versus doing something with the language that enlivens your ear, that invites you again to hear, to listen, to kind of take it all in. And there are many, many ways we do that, of how we invite, how we carve out a line. Yeah. What are some of the ways that we do that? Well, I already mentioned one, which is called onomatopoeia, right? Now, words that sound like what they mean, and that happens all the time in Shakespeare, and we'll look at different examples of that. So right off from the beginning, we have to be, right? And even the verb to be, right? It's a existential verb. It's only a couple of syllables, right? But to be, if we think of that vowel sound having not a quarter note, but a half note, possibly in musical terms, it gives the audience the kind of weight of be, right? It isn't to be or not to be. It's to be, is to exist, right? It's a bigger thing, or not, right? To be. And right off the bat, we have what is often referred to in Shakespeare, when we teach it, is called antithesis. And so much of Shakespeare's argument is built on setting one thing up against another. Often they're opposite, but they're in the, one is like on the balance of two sides of a scale. And if an actor points that up, right, it allows the audience to hear the way the argument is being constructed. So for instance, to be or not to be, to be or not to be. Yeah. And that might have been a little slow. I might have made a pause in the wrong place, whatever. But you get in my voice, you can hear me balancing that thought. That's the thing. That's the thesis statement of this whole speech, right? That is the question. Discovery. Oh, that is the question. Wow, what does that mean? That means it's the biggest question. So question takes on something bigger, yeah? And then he's going to redefine that. He's going to go from there and he's going to say, well, what does that exactly mean? That's a great thought, but I have to unpack that. So I say, let me see if I can figure that out. Whether 'tis nobler, right? Great word, nobler, right? He is a prince after all, in the mind, yeah? This is internal now. We see Hamlet kind of going inside to suffer. Oh, here we hear the big word. He's already talked about his suffering a lot in this play up until this point, yeah? To suffer. And here's where the register shifts. This is another tactic that actors have to use. They have to recognize where something is naturalistic and then where it gets poetic or heightens, right? And we hear it right off the bat. To be or not to be. That is the question, a very naturalistic line, right? Almost all one-syllable words, we know every single one of them. And then all of a sudden it gets a little bit bigger. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer, and here's a metaphor for the first time, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. All right, now that's something a lot bigger, right? And so automatically the actor has to understand that he's going, or she's going from naturalistic verse to something heightened, and do that in your voice, right? And make sure the audience is able to follow that shift in register, that heightening, that this is more important. And I have to find the most specific way I can think about it. I'm not just being poetic to be poetic, but it's important that you understand the idea. What is a sling and what is an arrow? We know a slingshot and an arrow. Those words actually have embedded in them, right? Have embedded in them, in their sound, what they do, right? And so we can get that right there. We say, the slings and arrows, and you can hear in that arrows and the S that comes in the end, the way it points, right? It wants to do what it says, yeah? This of outrageous. Outrageous is an outrageous word, right? It starts with this little, we get out, and then rage just explodes out of it. Outrageous fortune, yeah? Take bad luck, right? Outrageous fortune. Or we're going to continue with this war metaphor, to take arms, slings and arrows, against, and this is so great, right? A sea of troubles. And if I know I'm making that image and I just say, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them, I'm not helping. I'm not inviting you to hear the gravity, the weight, the density of that thought, right? Or to take arms against is great, right? Because it puts one thing against the other. It helps to build the argument. Or to take arms against a sea of troubles. And you hear in that, right, that I'm actually doing in my voice, I don't want to make it romper room, but you can hear the inflection of this is a sea of troubles. It means something that's never going to end, right? The tide rises and the tide falls. It just comes back and the troubles never end. This is where Hamlet's mindset is at the time. So I can do this vocally, right? To assist an audience to have that experience versus just saying the words as if they don't matter. I'm choosing as Hamlet to say the metaphor, sea of troubles, for a very specific reason. And I have to embody that. And I can do that with all of that, those technical things that I just mentioned, in order for you to hear it. I hope that makes sense. Let's go see if there's any questions. Were there any underrated playwrights from the same time as Shakespeare, but never made it because Shakespeare popularity? That's more true, I think, now than it was at the time. There were a lot of popular playwrights in Shakespeare's day. Nowadays, we very rarely get to see Christopher Marlowe, who was a genius too, right? Unless you just went to Burbage and saw their fantastic production of Edward II, which they just finished a couple months back. But you don't get to see Marlowe all that often. You don't get to see Ben Jonson all that often. There's a lot of playwrights from that period. This was the English Renaissance, and there was a great flowering of wonderful theatrical art, but Shakespeare kind of towers so far above them that it's hard for sometimes those other playwrights to get their head above the parapet, because frankly, he's better. And there's nothing like what he was able to do. No one really comes close. I have heard many school of thought when it comes to verse line endings. Do you believe the end of each verse line, there should be a beat or a breath, or should you plow through to the full stops? This is from Isabel. That's a great question. I think that the way verse lines are constructed, this is a little inside baseball for those of you who are actors. I'll give you an example. To be or not to be, that is the question. That's the end of a verse line. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer is the end of a verse line. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Now, it's easier to take a breath sense-wise after to be or not to be, that is the question, because it ends on a full stop, right? Versus whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. The tendency is going to want to run that line on. But if we're doing verse, we should be cognizant of verse line endings because it allows the audience to breath with us. And if we just give, it's not even a beat, it's like a micro thing, right? Let's see if we can bring that to life. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer what? The slings and arrows. So it gives us a chance often those verse line endings, if we take them, even just a microbeat, to discover where we're going. So we're coining thought, which is another one of these inflection points I'm talking about that actors need to discover. If I watch an actor who I think is just saying something he or she has already memorized, my ear turns off automatically. I want to know that this is happening in the present tense. I don't want to think that Hamlet knows all his lines and comes on stage and just says them. That's crap. We want to feel, right? We go to the theater to feel it happen together, that it can't happen unless I'm in the room with it. And so using verse lines correctly, taking a microbeat sometimes to help discover, to help energize the next line, the inflection of the next line can often help us do that. I hope that is but there are some times, which you might argue, you have to try it in rehearsal, that sometimes running through maybe is the best way to do it too, because it just gets the thought. And we want to be clear. Again, if clarity is our first principle, making it clear, that should always be a good guide for us. What are your thoughts? This is from Audrey on gender bending traditional male Shakespeare roles, specifically Hamlet, perhaps. This is a practice that has been around hundreds of years. We tend to think of this as a kind of something new in the theater. Ellen Terry played Hamlet in 1910. I don't even know when it was, but and that goes back even further than Ellen Terry was not the first female Hamlet. And there's great histories coming out about gender in Shakespeare. We've all seen Fiona Shaw play anything from, Richard II to, it's, I think, and vice versa, right? I mean, Shakespeare, of course, was the original gender bender in terms of the Elizabethan practice of an all-male cast, right? With boys playing the female roles, etc., which didn't change until, into the Restoration, right? When women were finally allowed on the stage. So I think nowadays these plays can take on so much that they can carry the weight as long as those interpretations and that the questions that the audience is going to ask about those kind of switches are answered within the production. I think there's an incredible, there's no reason why we can't embrace that across the board. Our most recent Shakespeare production from a couple of years ago was As You Like It, where, the play really, I think, my opinion, asks for that. The play is interrogating the idea of love in a way and gender in love in a way that he's already written that into the text in such a profound way that I think our explorations today are really just kind of expansions of what he started 400 years ago. This is Julie says, I had the privilege of putting on Hamlet in the GAM intensive last year, and your notes after the performance meant so much. Oh, well, that's very, very kind, Julie. I hope, thank you. I'm sure for giving a great performance. Good. Let's get back to troubles, and by opposing, end them. Wow, end, shit. Oops, sorry, shouldn't be swearing. End, yeah. End them, right? We hear this word, and this word's going to come back. Another thing that actors really have to pay attention to, and audiences, you have to hold us to this, is whenever I'm talking and I'm going to repeat myself, or I'm going to use a word or a phrase I've already used, I know I'm doing that, and I'm doing it for a reason. And Shakespeare does it all the time. He's going to have a lot of repeats coming up here. Right now, he gets to die, to sleep. He hears himself, Hamlet, say end, to end them. What does that mean? It means to die. What do I know about death is the next thought that has. And the only way he can kind of find a metaphor for death is with what we do in life every night for a few hours, at least, I hope, maybe less lately, is sleep, right? To die, to sleep. But it isn't really sleep. He says no more, right? So it's a troubled metaphor. It doesn't quite work, no more. And by asleep, he repeats it. So if I say to die, to sleep, end of the line, no more, new thought because I discovered that. And by asleep, Said it again. To say we end, which is the second time I've said end, to go back to where he started with this thought, right? So the intertextuality is important. And if I'm pointing that up in my voice, again, it's not that the audience has to understand it, but that they are able to hear the actor discover, right? Hear the actor discover in the moment what he or she is constructing in this incredibly complex exploration of the human condition. Yeah. To say we end what? The second end. Then we get to what is it? The heartache and the thousand natural shocks. End of line. That flesh is heir to. Wow, right? That's a big line. Again, filled with metaphor, register shift. It's definitely a heightened line. He says the heartache and the thousand natural shocks. Now, there's an opposite there that sometimes actors don't pick up on. So if we come to the audience, we say, to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. It seems like heartache and thousand natural shocks are the same thing versus heartache, which is emotional pain, and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to, right? That means emotional pain that we have in life, and then the slings and arrows, the pelting of the pitiless storm, right? Cuts and bruises and punches and kicks, bloodied noses, yeah? Cold, sickness. Those are natural shocks. We feel them naturally on our body. And then he has this great word. He says, the thousand natural, and if we hit natural, I get that opposite, the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Did you hear that? Flesh. Use the onomatopoeia of that. He doesn't say skin for a reason. Because skin doesn't do the same thing. Skin seems tougher than flesh, right? Flesh with that SH at the end, flesh, seems much more vulnerable, doesn't it? What can happen? The shock on the flesh is much different than the shock on skin or on a hide, right? Flesh is vulnerable. It's like he's sitting there talking about suicide, right? And if you can look and you can see the veins underneath of his skin, that's flesh, right? That is all of a sudden vulnerable to shock. That's vulnerable within one, as he says later, a bare bodkin, which is just a small knife. He can end his life that quickly, right? And flesh, the word itself, in the sound of the word, if I'm paying attention to it, gives me that, right? That flesh is heir to. The only thing he is an heir, of course, is a great irony in this word. And if he's pointing that up as he's saying it, we get that too, that he's already talked about the fact that how come he isn't king? He was the heir after all, and he's not king, right? So that flesh is heir to. And then he says, 'tis a consummation, which is a word we don't use all the time, but we know what consummate means, a final kind of lifting, yeah? The consummation devoutly to be wished. Uh-oh, right? He's just said it out loud. I want to die. And he's going to go on to say it, or maybe that's the best thing for us all, right? Devoutly to be wished. Wished what? To die. He repeats what he just said. To die, to sleep. He's going to repeat sleep again too. To die. Yeah? To sleep. And then he repeats sleep again and says to sleep, perchance to dream. There's the problem. And he says it, there's the rub. Now, we don't use the word rub anymore in this, but this is one of those Hamlet lines that has entered our lexicon as a cliche because it first started here. Yeah? There's the rub. That's the problem, he says, right? So isn't this great, the way it builds to die, to sleep? What does sleep mean? But if death is really like sleep, he's trying to describe what death is. It's almost impossible, right? To describe what death is, he's going to call it later, that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Nobody comes back this way to tell us what it was like, right? So what do we know? What do we think it is? We still go, the only thing we can think in our puny pea brains is it's like sleep. But if it really is like sleep, then that means when we're in that sleep of death, we can dream, I might not want that. I don't know about you lately, but most of my dreams in the past few weeks have been fraught, anxious about the situation we're currently in. I wouldn't want to live in an eternity of those dreams. They're actually nightmares, right? Here's a question from Cassidy. Because every word holds so much importance to the thought, what is a good rule for choosing when different editions have slightly different words? Oh, see, I'm glad there's a lot of actors out there. Again, this isn't for the audience coming in, but there's a lot of editions of Shakespeare in terms of scholarship and editing, and different scholars kind of argue for different words in different places based on extant quartos, folios, which are different editions of the plays as they came to be. A good thing to remember is Shakespeare's plays weren't even collected as one until 1623, when a couple of actors from his company put together the first folio. And that was the first time that I think about 19, and about half of his plays were actually ever published in print. So the world of the print. So what we have of Shakespeare comes from a lot of different sources. It comes from actors having copied out their roles. It comes from all over the place, and sometimes they're cobbled together. So scholars do argue over what words sometimes belong where. Sometimes it's just to answer your question, Cassidy, is pick the best one for your production and what works for you guys. How do you prepare, Dylan asked, for performing Shakespeare? Just like you prepare for everything else, and everything I'm telling you right now, which is, read, work, rehearse, and technique. And all of these things that I'm talking about here, technically, that actors can do to help the audience make it clear. Yeah, you really have to, work hard. It, especially a big role in Shakespeare, will really take it out of you physically as well. It's very much like an athletic event. So back to die, to sleep. What do we say? To sleep? Perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. And now, what is the rub? He has to describe the rub. Remember, the speech goes from generality to be or not to be. The most general verb ever is to be. What does it mean? It means a lot of things, right? Now we're getting to it. Here's the sleep of death, the rub. What is the rub? The rub is, for in that sleep of death, that's about the 5th time he said sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, right? Now, what I did right there was try to discover that, because sometimes actors will come on and they do the Shakespeare-made shruggy version, which if I'm looking in here, what does it say? It says, after all, where is it? Aye, but there's the catch. In death's sleep, who knows what kind of dreams might come after we put the noise and commotion of life behind us. So after we've put the noise and commotion of life behind us versus what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, right? Now that's an incredible metaphor, right? And what is it? It brings all sorts of things to mind, but more, and this of course has entered the lexicon too. You'll hear people talking about shuffling off this mortal coil a lot. It sounds like a snake shedding its skin, right? In a machine age, since the industrial age, a coil has something else. There's something about the mechanical nature, of especially the kind of disaffected human life, that's there. Am I just a machine? I mean, there's all sorts of things. And the only way I allow the audience to have that experience is by discovering it myself. If I just run through it and say, shuffle off this mortal coil, like I didn't say shuffle off this mortal coil, but I said instead commotion and noise left behind us, the audience doesn't get the kind of weight of that, right? I have to discover it. I have to come up with it in the moment and say, what does this life feel to me like right now? And I'm expressing feeling. I'm expressing emotion that way. And that goes right to the audience's heart. The clarity is not just in the content, but it's also in the form constantly. What else we got? Shameless plugs are coming up on this. If you can see them on the side there, we have an online classic monologues class with Fred Sullivan Jr. starting March 30th. Take that one up. You can get to work on Shakespeare with Fred, who's the greatest teacher in the world. Where you get to explore and develop the acting of Shakespeare's characters through a monologue workshop with a master coach. I would absolutely back that up. Most of all of the Shakespeare that I've worked on in my life has been with Fred in one form or another. And it's and to say a master coach is putting it mildly. So take that class. All right. I often find myself, David says, stuck acting from the neck up. What exercises, books, or rehearsal techniques would you recommend to actors looking to more fully embody Shakespeare's language? Okay, well, this one I already put up, Thinking Shakespeare by David Edelstein. And of course, John Barton's Playing Shakespeare, which you can catch on YouTube and watch it on YouTube. It's in book form as well, but the book is best followed along with the video because you're watching actors actually do it constantly, and they're addressing all of the problems you talk about. Yes, your body is important. That you rightly call it acting from the neck up means that we haven't quite connected. That language is physical expression, and it means head to toe physical expression. It's not just kind of here in the lips, the teeth, and the tip of the tongue. So the more we get in our bodies, the more we know what we're saying and we're on action. And all of these techniques that we're talking about, technique, will lead to confidence. And confidence is when you're fully bodied. When you're cut off from the neck down, it's because you're not confident. and you're trying to kind of betray a confidence with your voice that your body cannot possibly go with. Yeah. And so your body is telling the person watching you that you're lying. So you've got to find confidence. And the only way to find confidence is with technique. I have studied this author and worked on him since I was, about 20 years old. I'm almost 50. That's a long time. And I'm still working hard and getting a little better at it all the time. It is a lifetime pursuit. If you think you can get it right off the bat in a couple of weeks workshop, it's not going to happen. You have to have appetite, you have to love it, and you have to devote kind of every day to working on it if you want to kind of bring it to an audience in the way that they deserve. So that's what I would say to that. So don't act from the neck up. Daria asks about breath techniques. Yeah, breathing is everything, right? And these books, etc., we'll talk about those as well. Get a good vocal coach. But I would recommend singing training. And that's kind of ironic coming from me, who may be the world's worst singer. But nevertheless, those of you, if you can take singing lessons, will help you to engage your breath in a very, very deep way, to fill and to be able to take on some of the long thoughts, etc., that Shakespeare asks of you in these incredibly heightened and powerful, large ways of expressing character. So yes, where were we? Jumping back into the speech again. Shuffled off again, discovering this mortal coil must give us pause, right? Pause. That stops us, yeah? And then now he's coming to something. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. Isn't that fantastic? Within one line, right, that makes calamity is a 4-syllable word, and then we have 3 short syllables, so long life, yeah? To get back to, just as a little inside baseball, to get back to the rhythm question of iambic pentameter, right, blank verse. If we put that line in there, we would say that makes calamity of so long life, right? That's how it stretches out. So long is in an unstressed position. But in order to get the idea that the pause, the respect, yeah, that we don't want to die, right? Because of what may come in death. We don't know what to do in death. So we put up with the shocks, etc., right? That respect makes calamity, right? A great 4-syllable word that sounds like what it is. It's 4 syllables jammed together, calamity, right? Like this, calamity, and then of so long life, which is its opposite, right? That within this drudgery, we have chaos, yeah? One line, right? That makes calamity of so long life. And then you can hear in Hamlet's expression of that how do I end it? Oh God, right? It deepens, it deepens, it deepens. And there's something, form and content, again, which happens in Shakespeare all the time, coming together to make meaning that powerful, right? It's not just that you're understanding the words I'm saying intellectually or by their definition, you're hearing it emotionally in how they're expressed. Calamity of so long life, that within this drudgery, this happens constantly. How could anyone put up with that? We must long for death, that consummation, devoutly to be wished, right? Okay. Wow, there's a lot in this speech. And now he's going to go on to say, that's a very general thing, calamity. What does that mean for so long life? For who would put up with, he says, who would bear the whips and scorns of time? He doesn't say for who would put up with the crap, which is a shruggy way of saying it. He actually uses metaphor again by saying whips and scorns of time, right? Again, we get that a physical jolt, the whips and scorns of time, that everything, that living through that calamity that makes life so long, whips and scorns, right? We can hear that. And now he's going to go from the general of what they are to very specific things, yeah? And he has a list of very specific things. Now in Shakespeare, when you hear a list, it always means a couple of things for an actor. It means you have to go up in energy, and that each thing in that list has to be specific and different, yeah? Because they're all different thoughts. The mistake actors often make, that I get, when I hear it, it drives me a little crazy in the audience because it makes me not understand, and I want to understand, is for who would bear the whips and scorns of time? And here comes the list. The oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, blah, blah, blah. That's a list. Now, when actors do it like that, as if everything means the same, I don't hear any of it. I just hear generally that life sucks, then you die, right? That's kind of what the speech means. But if that were all it is, we'd get it done in, life sucks, then you die. 5 words, right? Right? So the first one is the oppressor's wrong, someone who's oppressing me. And now Hamlet, as the character, the actor playing Hamlet, has to think about who has oppressed Hamlet, right? Who is oppressing him? It's got to be specific, personal to him as a character. So when I think of that, and maybe it's Claudius, maybe there's a lot of people who oppress him in this play, then I have a specific thought. The oppressor's wrong. And the way I say oppressor knows I'm talking about somebody specifically. The proud man's contumely. Now, contumely is one of the words we talked about, which is one of the only word, we don't use it anymore, really. It means kind of sneering derision, right? But I can put that into my voice as an actor. I can say the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, like look down my nose as I say it, and we get it. The proud man, the person who puts himself above me, looking down at me and treating me like garbage, right? The proud man's, the pangs of despised love. Now, he's just broken up, or he's about to, actually. He's already broken up. He's about to have an awful scene. The nunnery scene follows the speech hard on, right, with Ophelia. He knows from the pangs of despised, sometimes in some editions it's disprized love. You can, Cassidy, pick the word you think is best. Then we get the law's delay, right? Justice. Where is justice in this world that's been so unjust to him lately? The insolence of office, again, Claudius, people who have higher position, Polonius, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes. This, what we put up with, to take on the crap from people who don't deserve our attention. But we sit there and we nod and we go, we know we have these people in our lives, right? That we just go nod and we try to get them out of the room. I go, I have to listen to this jerk one more time. I'm going to put a bullet in my head, right? Which is what he's about to say. Yeah, except he doesn't say bullet. He says bare bodkin. So now we have a list that is all separate things that all mean something very different to Hamlet, and yet they all have to build an energy, right? So that they climax at the end, right? And we have the energy to go into the next thought. So we get the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes when he himself might his quietus make with the bare bodkin, right? Then all of that stuff, boom, climaxes, and he says very simply, when you could just end it by slicing your throat, or this flesh right here that I can see, boom, done, yeah? That's how easy it is. All of that pain, that is a direct mirror or a specification of the calamity that makes of so long life. He just spelled it out for us. What do those calamities look like that? He just told us. That's brilliant, right? That's a speech. Now, actor has to understand that and be able to play that, right? Has to be able to understand that it has to build, has to go, and has to balance it. We talked about this antithesis, to be or not to be. That is the question, right? That this one thing that goes against the other, that entire phrase, that entire speech goes this. It's all heightened, then it's all intense, and then it's just this, right? It comes down to the bare bodkin, nothing. And usually Hamlet has a knife on him, and he can certainly show the audience that, because if we don't know that a bodkin is a small knife, we get it visually and we're with them, right? We just keep going along with him, yeah? And then he's going to go, he's just talked about real practical things and dealing with it. And then he puts it into an existential form, back to the be of to be, right? Again, this isn't just about, it's about heartache and 1,000 natural shocks. We're talking about the natural shocks here in the first one. And now we're going to go to the heartache part of it. He says, who would fardels bear? Now, fardels means burden. We don't use that word. That's one of the very few words in here, like contumely, that we don't know anymore. But I can do that. I can say, who would fardels bear, right? And I get it if I keep going, to grunt and sweat under a weary life. Now, grunt and sweat, we could say to grunt and sweat, like it doesn't mean anything, but he chooses grunt and sweat for a reason. To grunt and sweat, it's like an animal, like an ox, right? Under a weary life. And isn't that a great word? Weary. Weary is a weary word. The way it stretches away from that middle vowel sound, a weary life. And I can put that into my voice. Yeah. To grunt, right? Cut off with that NT, and sweat, again, two sharp endings with a weary life, right? So again, we have that opposite construction in there. Poetically is in form and content telling me that idea very, very powerfully, to grunt and sweat under a weary life. And now we get to the problem, but that the dread of something after death. Now, this is very important, because he's going to sum up, he's getting to the summation of this, the consummation of the speech. And we've got to really keep in mind this antithetical construction, because if we don't, the audience will never follow this next very thorny kind of one breath thing. Yeah. So we've got to walk us through it here. If an actor just says, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, I'm not going to get that at all. But if I can walk the audience through that, so Hamlet is discovering it himself, doesn't have it prepared already, is creating this thought in the moment, remember, is coining. He says, but that the dread of something after death, and after is important. Once we're dead, what comes after? Doesn't know yet, right? But the dread of something after death. And then he's going to describe death poetically, yeah? In a phrase that has come down to us and that we remember. And then in order for me to get back to the subject, I've got to use pitch here. This is another one of those inflection tools that actors and audiences need to listen for. Yeah, if I want you to understand it, I have to make sure you get the subject, verb, and object. And when I have something that describes it in the middle, I've got to use pitch to make sure that I set that off. It's a parenthetical phrase. So, but that the dread of something after death. Now pitch. The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Come back down to the previous pitch. Puzzles the will. Right? So I connect the sentence there, which is that the dread of something after death puzzles the will, is what the audience has to hear. That phrase in the middle about the traveler returning is parenthetical, right? So I can use pitch to separate that and get all of that beautiful thought in there and still bring home the subject, the verb, and the object, right? The dread of something after death puzzles the will is the thought, right? And then he goes on, and we've got to use antithesis here, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly, right? Bear and fly are opposites, to others that we know not of. That's the problem. There's the rub he talked about earlier. And thus, right? Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. That's the summation, yeah? Not quite done yet, though. After all of that. Yeah, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. Isn't that great? Yeah, we get the native hue of resolution, right? The impulse, the biological drive, the thing, it's do it, just do it, yeah, right? I get an impulse, you slap me, I slap you back, right? The native hue of resolution is sicklied. Now that's a very specific verb, right? Is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. So we have native hue and resolution and pale cast and thought. And if I don't set those up in my voice so that you hear them as opposites, you'll never get that thought. But when you do, you go, that's exactly the human condition. That's exactly the problem, is we have these impulses and then we think about them because we're humans, we're not apes. We actually put them into our frontal lobe and try to rationalize, which is the journey of this entire play is embedded in this speech alone. He's trying to say, what is it like to be human? It is weighing the ape with the Enlightenment, yeah? And he determines at one point in the play that the Enlightenment is not the way to go, become the ape, and it turns out to be all wrong. And it may be you could argue, the fatal flaw, right? This is what this whole play is about, that the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. And enterprises of great pitch, sometimes it's pith, and moment, pitch and moment, with this regard, their currents, like a river, turn awry and lose the name of action. Right? So we started with to be or not to be, and we end with action. And as soon as he gets there, he figures out the problem. He hasn't got an answer for it, but he figures out where the problem lies. Yeah, Ophelia comes in, and he tells himself to shut up and redirects the conversation. Yeah? Now, there's so much more in this speech. That's just a kind of beginning, a tip of the iceberg, to talk about what an actor does to go through it and what we're listening for. Let me see if there's any questions in here. Someone needs, do you believe that the actor playing Hamlet should deliver this monologue as if they know they're being heard, or a truth they're trying to figure out on their own? I always have, that's a great question. Derek Jacobi, who's the greatest Shakespearean actor in the world, period, always thinks it should be done. He puts Ophelia in the room whenever he's directed it and when he's done it, and that it's done for her. I don't agree. I think it's something he's got to figure out with the audience. I think it's for him and the audience, not for another character on stage. What else? How would you scan when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause? There's the respect. How would you scan? Scan is a word meaning how would we beat out the rhythm? You know, how would we figure out the rhythm? Let me see here. What was the line you asked about? When we have shuffled off. So if it were a regular verse line, I always ask the if, right? If it were a regular iambic pentameter verse line or a blank verse line, it would go, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, right? It's kind of right there, yeah. Must give us pause, there's the respect. It's weird in the second half of that line. So I wouldn't worry about the scansion. I would just say, where's the natural stress want to go when we have shuffled off this mortal coil? So you can hear where the strong stresses are there. They just want to go that way. Must give us pause. There's the respect. So don't get too caught up in it has to kind of go along that way. He's breaking that rhythm all the time. Think about natural stress versus the kind of stress of the line. But natural stress usually wants to win. What does your impulse say and tell you? And if it's different than what the rhythmic stress is, it may be for a reason. For instance, so long life. It should be so long life, right? So long life, yeah, there. But when I put an emphasis or a stress on long, which is an unstressed position, it actually stresses it more because we're used to hearing this, and then we hear instead of da-dun, 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 we hear da-dun, dun, and we go, that dun really comes out at me, so long life really happens. So that is more to talk about with that, but hopefully that helps a little bit. How conscious is Hamlet of the audience? Is it a conversation or more of him speaking to himself? I think in all of Shakespeare, when it's a soliloquy, meaning when an actor is alone on stage, I think 99% of the time, and I can't even think of the 1%, but this would be for your rehearsal process, is to talk to the audience. You have to have some place to land this, and I think he's actually asking the audience to help him understand it. So maybe when someone does give you a line back, you can deal with that. I think Macbeth is the same way, Lear is the same way. When they're alone, they've got to be looking at the audience and talking and saying, do you understand this? Do you feel this with me? Do you get it? And when you're out there, it makes it much easier to act. Having the privilege of doing this a couple of times, being able to deal with an audience has been made all the difference. So always, I think, give it to the audience. So that's a kind of walk through that speech with some things that we talked about in terms of like what an actor can do. And I'm just going to go back over them, a couple of invitations that we should be listening for and that actors can do. Antithesis, weighing the opposites in your voice so that the argument is clear. Onomatopoeia, using sound, right, for meaning, right? Sound as meaning, slings and arrows. I can put that in there. There's other things in here. Sea of troubles. So somehow I'm using the sound, even when it's not direct onomatopoeia, to tell the audience what I mean. Sustain. Turn a quarter note into a half note. Yeah, to be or not to be, right? Versus to be or not to be, right? There's something about the be having a long vowel and me getting to hear that. Yeah, I'm exaggerating that a little, but you get my point. It gives the audience time to hear. Pitch, right? Using pitch, as I just talked about at the end of that speech, to delineate, right? So that we can always connect the subject, the verb, and the object, and the decorative stuff can kind of go somewhere else in our voice. Tactic shift. We haven't even talked a lot about his last word of the speech, which is action, right? What is his action and how is he going about trying to achieve it, and how we shift. When something doesn't work, you got to try something new. When the audience sees me go somewhere else or turn a corner, they stay with me. Their ear stays open. Yeah, register shift. When does it go from naturalistic to something heightened? And what do we do vocally in order to kind of invest that height, to invest that poetry with the weight that it needs? Discovery. Very, very important to coin in the moment. If this is not happening in the present, it's not happening. It feels like it's by rote. The audience's ear goes off and they're asleep well before intermission. Yeah. And verbs carry action. Always those are the strong words. When you ask where to stress, usually it's in the verb. Yeah, verb. That we want to coin, meaning discover. We want to carve. We carve out specifically thought by thought. So we're moving, and that we chew those words technically. Yeah, we chew them. These are the 4 C words I always talk about with my students. We chew them. We really use our lips, teeth, tip of the tongue. Yeah, so that nothing worse than someone mumbling Shakespeare. You can't understand any of it. And then cost. Always going back to there is an emotional cost. What is it? How does it specifically affect that character? Like that list I talked about, they all need to be something that Hamlet has experienced in the play. Yeah. So what is your favorite soliloquy from Hamlet? I think that's probably a great place to end because it's the one we just worked on. And even though there's several more of them, and perhaps in next episodes we'll look at that. But this is the fundamental. This is the core. This is the reason why this speech is kind of at the core of modern English poetry, even beyond the theater, right? Well. Anyway, what time we got? Oh my goodness gracious! This has been over an hour. Half of you are probably dead asleep, but you can come back and watch the rest of it at some other point if you didn't catch something or you had to beg off. I'm going to be coming back, and we're going to do this again a week from Friday. If anybody has a suggestion about a speech or a question they'd like to throw out, let us know at the GAM, and perhaps we'll kind of cover that as we come back to it. Again, just thinking about that you shouldn't be afraid of this, and it's the greatest author in the world for a reason. And our mission here is always to bring it to you clearly and powerfully, and never make you feel stupid or it's not for you. It is absolutely for all of us, which is why it's lasted this long. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you're safe and well. I know I've been blathering a bit. I hope some of it, it increased your appreciation or love, or gave you even just a little distraction in times when those are getting more and more precious. So appreciate you tuning in, and look for more from the GAM. Keep in touch with us. We'll keep in touch with you. And thank you so much for your support.